Hey heroes, and welcome to another mighty episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an event of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. This week's tale is about a man by the name of Calvin Zabo. Born in Trenton, New Jersey, Zabo was a brilliant medical scientist with a PhD in psychopharmacology. However, he was also an incredibly immoral and unscrupulous individual who had a peculiar obsession with the literary classic The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Scottish novelist Robert Louis Stevenson. I'm sure most of you are at least passingly familiar with the story, but in Stevenson's 1886 novella, the titular Dr. Henry Jekyll ingested a special elixir that transformed him into a malevolent, self-indulgent troublemaker known as Edward Hyde. Now, I will note that it is possible that this actually happened in the Marvel Universe as well, as it was presented in the pages of supernatural thrillers. This kind of thing would not be unprecedented, since Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Bram Stoker's Dracula were both confirmed as being based on actual events on Earth-616. But whereas those monsters have returned in the modern day, the same cannot be said about the classical Mr. Hyde. In either case, Calvin Zabo believed Stevenson's tale to be more than mere fiction and devoted himself to concocting a formula that could unleash a man's bestial nature. He spent years experimenting on himself, subtly altering his own DNA before any outward changes were apparent. To fund his experiments, he regularly stole from his employers, moving quickly from one job to the next to avoid criminal charges, and while he was never prosecuted, his infamous reputation spread throughout the medical community. In the midst of this moving around, he spent time in New Orleans, where he had regular visits with a sex worker named Kimberly Jennifer Johnson, who, unbeknownst to Zabo, was a descendant of the hidden Inhuman race. This resulted in the birth of a baby girl, Daisy Louise Johnson, but Zabo ultimately left to continue his experiments, and Kim Johnson gave up Daisy for adoption, only 7 months after her birth. Daisy was raised by the Sutton family in Portland, Oregon, who changed her name to Corey. However, her father's altered genetics, combined with her mother's inhuman heritage, caused her to develop superhuman abilities without having to undergo pterogenesis. Specifically, the power to generate earthquake-causing vibrations, and years later she was eventually recruited by Nick Fury, who told her about her real name and heritage, and Daisy Johnson became a superhuman SHIELD agent codenamed Quake. But getting back to the story at hand, at some point Cal Zabo also helped found a twisted club in Manhattan's Alphabet City called Skin and Bones. The mastermind behind that endeavor was a sadistic former assassin known only as Morphine, who founded the club so that he and like-minded individuals could capture and torture members of the local homeless population. Zabo in particular had a habit of slicing open his victims to expose a length of bone and then etching his name onto it, all without letting the victim die, a technique that was dubbed his visceral signature. While in New York, Zabo also attempted to get a job with the noted surgeon Donald Blake, thinking that Blake's reliance on a walking cane would make him an easy target to steal from. However, Blake was well aware of Zabo's poor reputation among the medical community and rejected him. It was only a few months after that encounter that Zabo finally perfected the formula he'd been working on for years and successfully transformed himself into his own version of Mr. Hyde. Unlike the literary Hyde, however, Zabo's formula caused him to grow noticeably taller and bulkier, endowing him with superhuman strength. His initial formula was said to grant him the power of a dozen men, but subsequent variations have made him even larger and stronger, most often growing from Zabo's normal size of 5'11" and 185 pounds to a whopping 6'5" and 420 pounds, at which point he is capable of lifting up to 50 tons of weight. In his debut outing, he attempted to murder Donald Blake for insulting him, pushing the lame doctor out of a high-rise window, but of course Hyde had no way of knowing that Blake was secretly capable of transforming as well, in his case into the thunder god Thor. And so naturally Blake survived and preserved his secret by claiming that Thor saved him, which in a way was not untrue. As Mr. Hyde, Zabo subsequently impersonated Thor while robbing one of the largest banks in New York, tarnishing the hero's reputation while simultaneously gaining more funds for himself. He then captured Blake, intending on killing him with a time bomb while escaping by submarine with an unwilling Jane Foster, and while Blake ultimately succeeded in transforming into Thor and rescuing Jane, Hyde ultimately slipped away, his true identity of Calvin Zabo having gone undiscovered. He returned to his lab, which by coincidence was later infiltrated by another superhuman, Klaus Voorhees, aka the Cobra, who had gained serpentine abilities after being bitten by a radioactive snake. Mr. Hyde and the Cobra briefly clashed, but soon realized that they were both enemies of Thor, and the two forged a villainous partnership. Using a device that Zabo had created called the Time Reversal Ray, which was capable of displaying images of a subject's recent past, the two villains tracked Thor to Donald Blake's office and attacked, but the hero preserved his dual identity with some clever misdirection. Naturally, this led to a battle between Thor and the two villains, but it soon became clear that even together they were outmatched by the Thunder God, and this time Mr. Hyde was defeated and arrested along with the Cobra. They did not remain imprisoned for long, however, as they were later freed by Loki, who bolstered their powers and sent them to abduct Jane Foster as part of another scheme to strike at Thor. However, even with his strength increased, Hyde was defeated once again as he and the Cobra bickered and got in each other's way. Of course, this was just the start of Hyde's villainous career, and he went on to menace various heroes over the following years. During the wedding of Reed Richards and Susan Storm, Mr. Hyde was one of many villains to be manipulated by Dr. Doom into attacking the ceremony and its heroic guests. In the ensuing conflict, Hyde attempted to one-up the Executioner by taking down Captain America, but was intercepted by Hawkeye. In a later incident, Hyde and the Cobra caught sight of Thor speaking with Daredevil and suspected that the man without fear could be a problem for them in the future. Hoping to nip this in the bud, Hyde developed a chemical ironically meant to rob a man of his eyesight, and while one might suspect that the already blind hero would be unaffected, it turns out that Hyde's concoction had the unexpected effect of suppressing Daredevil's enhanced senses. Even with this handicap, however, Daredevil was able to even the playing field by shutting off the lights to the villain's hideout, plunging the arena into darkness, and throwing Hyde and the Cobra off their game long enough for him to find the antidote for Hyde's chemical and restore his abilities. But while Daredevil defeated and captured the Cobra, Mr. Hyde's monstrous strength allowed him to escape yet again. Hyde later broke the Cobra out of prison, and the two joined forces with yet another of Daredevil's foes, the theatrically acrobatic criminal Jonathan Powers, better known as the Jester, but their attempts to take down Daredevil failed once again, and this time Mr. Hyde was arrested. Sometime after that, Hyde was abducted from prison by an android from thousands of years in the future, Mr. Klein, also known simply as the Assassin. To briefly explain his story, he originated in the potential future timeline Reality 71778, in which a supercomputer named Bale was created to govern the entire planet somewhere around the 120th century. I will note that there are some conflicting accounts regarding the time period, but we're just gonna go with what the official handbooks say. In any event, there was apparently some sort of catastrophe during Bale's time, which by the 141st century had left the Earth completely devoid of human life. As a result, Bale sent the android MK9, aka Mr. Klein, back in time to the Marvel Age in an attempt to alter the timeline and prevent their barren future from coming to pass. While the exact details of the chain of events they were averting were apparently known only to Bale and Klein, this scheme involved targeting District Attorney Foggy Nelson and industrialist Tony Stark, which of course put Klein at odds with both Daredevil and Iron Man. In one of his plots, Klein abducted Mr. Hyde and the Scorpion Mac Gargan from prison, placing them in suspended animation before creating android duplicates of both. Posing as the real deal, the phony Scorpion lured Daredevil and the Black Widow into a battle only to seemingly fall to his death, making it appear as if the Widow had killed him. The Mr. Hyde android was then sent to destroy the Scorpion android before an autopsy could be performed, and while the phony Hyde briefly clashed with Daredevil, he ultimately destroyed both himself and the Scorpion, leaving no evidence of either. In any event, Klein's convoluted schemes were ultimately halted by a pair of beings from even further in the future, the final Sons of Man. These two enigmatic entities apparently hailed from the 170th century of Earth 711042, a potential future timeline for Klein's reality 71778. Now, I know this is getting a little complicated, but the important thing is that in the end, the final Sons of Man destroyed Klein and his operations, before presumably returning to their own timeline. In the wake of all that nonsense, the Scorpion was left in suspended animation in Klein's abandoned mansion, but he eventually awakened due to an imperfection in the machine and roused his fellow captive, Mr. Hyde. However, those two had no idea who had captured them or why, and mistakenly assumed that, given the level of technology used, S.H.I.E.L.D. must have been responsible. Seeking vengeance, they attacked and abducted S.H.I.E.L.D. agent Sharon Carter, but were ultimately tracked down and defeated by Captain America and the Falcon. In that conflict, Mr. Hyde fought Captain America one-on-one, and while Hyde had the advantage in raw strength, Cap's skill and tenacity allowed him to deliver a crushing defeat to the mad villain, breaking his ribs before knocking him unconscious. The heroes left the two villains tied up for the authorities, but before the police arrived, Hyde regained consciousness and slipped free from his bonds by transforming back into Calvin Zabo. While he had escaped once again, his string of defeats had left him low on funds and supplies, and an ill-fated attempt to steal enough chemicals to brew more of his Hyde formula ended with him being arrested, after which he spent several months in prison as Calvin Zabo. Now, it's important to note that at this point, the only person who had ever seen him transform and knew that Calvin Zabo and Mr. Hyde were one and the same was the Cobra, who during this time was in and out of jail as a member of the Serpent Squad. And so Zabo wasn't actually convicted of any of Hyde's crimes and was released after only half a year in prison. Still low on supplies, he retrieved an emergency dose of his formula that he had hidden years prior, allowing him to transform one more time. While he and the Cobra had grown to despise each other, with Zabo resentful about rotting in jail while the Cobra traipsed around with other allies, the two nonetheless agreed to work together again. This time the pair stole what Hyde needed to further enhance his chemical using a formula recorded by the ancient sorcerer Cagliostro, but before the unique concoction could be completed, Daredevil intervened and destroyed the one and only dose. Hyde and Cobra were both sent to Rikers Island, but then the prison was taken over by the mind-controlling supervillain Zebediah Killgrave, aka the Purple Man, who released them and others from their cells to use as pawns in his own scheme to strike at Daredevil. Killgrave sent the Cobra and Mr. Hyde to abduct Daredevil and bring him back to Rikers, and while they succeeded in this task, Daredevil was aided by the masked mercenary known only as Paladin, and ultimately defeated the Purple Man. After that, Hyde was imprisoned once again and kept sedated, and while the Cobra later broke out, he left Hyde behind, ignoring his former partner's pleas. Swearing vengeance, Hyde got a message out offering $5 million to anyone that could successfully free him, a bounty that caught the notice of the French mercenary Georges Batroc. But while his company was successful in executing the breakout, Batroc was dismayed to learn that Hyde didn't actually have that kind of cash. Instead, Hyde convinced Batroc to help him get the money by hijacking a highly volatile Roxxon oil supertanker and using it to blackmail Roxxon by holding Manhattan hostage and threatening to ram the tanker into the docks, causing it to explode. That's what Hyde told Batroc anyway, but in truth he planned on destroying the city whether or not they got paid, simply because he believed that the Cobra would be killed in the blast. That level of meaningless mass slaughter, however, was a step too far for Batroc, who turned against Hyde after learning of his intentions, and in the end the French mercenary joined forces with Captain America to stop Mr. Hyde. This time, Hyde's rage and strength almost allowed him to overpower both of his foes, but in his anger he ripped a pipe from the side of the tanker, intending on using it as a weapon, but inadvertently coating himself with pressurized coolant, freezing him and causing him to fall into the water. However, Hyde's superhuman physiology allowed him to survive, and he subsequently succeeded in tracking down the Cobra with the intent of killing his former partner slowly and painfully. Fortunately for the Cobra, Spider-Man intervened, saving the villain's life. In the ensuing battle, Mr. Hyde was knocked out of a window and fell several stories to the ground, and while he survived, he was arrested once again. This time, however, the authorities underestimated Hyde and were unable to sufficiently sedate him. Breaking free, he once again attempted to take revenge on the Cobra, pursuing his former partner into the city, where their battle was interrupted by Spider-Man and the Black Cat. In the end, Hyde was defeated once again, but this time it took the combined powers of Spider-Man, Black Cat, and the Cobra working together to take him down. Before he could be imprisoned again, however, he was freed from custody by Baron Helmut Zemo, who recruited Hyde into his villainous group, the Masters of Evil. Now, not exactly a team player, the brutish Hyde clashed with the other villains, however, Zemo was able to secretly sedate him enough to keep him in line. For context, Zemo covertly injected Hyde with a concentrated dose of tranquilizer that was apparently strong enough to render an elephant unconscious, but for Hyde it was just enough to calm him down. Alongside the Masters of Evil, Hyde participated in an infamous attack on Avengers Mansion referred to as the Under Siege incident. In this conflict, Hyde attacked and captured both Edwin Jarvis and Dane Whitman, the Black Knight, although in the latter case he had to be convinced by his teammate Yellow Jacket not to simply kill his foe. He was also one of several villains alongside the Wrecking Crew and Goliath who battered the Avenger Hercules so badly that the demigod had to be hospitalized. Finally, when Baron Zemo attempted to torture a captive Captain America by destroying his personal belongings, Mr. Hyde crushed the hero's original non-vibranium shield from 1940 and even intended on beating Jarvis to death in front of both Captain America and the Black Knight. Fortunately, the two heroes escaped in time to stop him and were subsequently aided by a number of fellow Avengers. In the end, Hyde was temporarily blinded by the Wasp, Janet Van Dyne, and lashed out in a mad rage, inadvertently crashing into Thor and effectively knocking himself out. He later escaped from custody yet again and attempted to return to his criminal ways alone, but subsequently discovered that after spending so much time in the guise of Mr. Hyde, the original formula that previously transformed him back into Calvin Zabo no longer worked. In an attempt to brew a stronger version, he ended up making one that would prevent him from ever becoming Mr. Hyde again, but he was ironically prevented from using it by his old foe, Daredevil, who mistakenly believed that Hyde was again attempting to increase his power. Deciding that he had too many enemies to risk permanently losing the ability to transform, Hyde destroyed this new formula, but was defeated once again when the ensuing battle with Daredevil spilled into the subway and Hyde was electrocuted into unconsciousness. After that, Hyde was imprisoned in Colorado's newly constructed superhuman holding facility, the Vault, where he apparently had a short-lived dalliance with his fellow inmate, the mutant criminal Necra. He participated in more than one mass breakout attempt, and while 2 of these were thwarted by heroes like the Avengers and Freedom Force, a subsequent attempt was more successful, and Mr. Hyde was among 38 escapees. With Hyde free again, the Cobra decided to lure him into a final confrontation, destroying several of Zabo's hideouts to get his attention. In the ensuing battle, the Cobra tricked Hyde into thinking that he had poisoned him and forced the brutish villain to beg for his life in exchange for the antidote. The supposed antidote, however, was actually a sedative powerful enough to knock even Hyde out when ingested, and the Cobra claimed victory over his foe, subsequently changing his name to King Cobra. After awakening, Hyde mostly abandoned his quest for revenge against the Cobra, but later had a chance encounter with Bruce Banner, who the media once described as a modern-day Jekyll and Hyde, much to Zabo's annoyance. Naturally, this led to a battle between Mr. Hyde and the Incredible Hulk, specifically, and perhaps fittingly, the more malicious gray-skinned version of the Hulk, for whom the Jekyll and Hyde comparison was originally made. In any event, Hyde vastly underestimated the Hulk's strength, and their battle ended with Hyde plummeting into a ravine and sustaining a head injury. After coming to, Calvin Zabo found himself in human form once again, but temporarily unable to transform. Still cocky and belligerent, he earned the ire of a biker gang on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, but in the ensuing conflict he successfully transformed into Mr. Hyde yet again. The resulting commotion drew the attention of the Ghost Rider, specifically the Danny Ketch Ghost Rider, who briefly battled Mr. Hyde. However, Hyde ultimately fled, not wanting to be sent back to the Vault. He returned to human form and attempted to lay low, but was attacked in the night by a life-force-sapping demon known as Succubus. Now, this creature had been sent by the dream demon Nightmare to attack the Ghost Rider, but an encounter with the Spirit of Vengeance left her weakened, and when she went looking for victims to replenish her strength, she just so happened to find Calvin Zabo. In trying to drain his life force, she inadvertently triggered his transformation, and Mr. Hyde attacked both her and his old foe, Daredevil, who was tracking the succubus after hearing her attack a previous victim. That battle ended when the Ghost Rider intervened and defeated Mr. Hyde with the power of his penance stare, a hellish technique that forces its target to experience the pain and guilt of their own misdeeds. Suffice it to say he was down for the count, and the succubus even attempted to finish what she started, but this was far from the end for Mr. Hyde. Eventually recovering, he resurfaced in Canada and battled several members of Alpha Flight in downtown Toronto. Wanting to taunt the Hulk, who at the time was in his more intelligent professor persona, Hyde subsequently joined the Wizard, the Living Laser, and the Absorbing Man in attending the wedding of Hulk's allies, Rick Jones and Marlo Chandler, having received legitimate invitations from the mischievous alien known as the Impossible Man. As Calvin Zabo, he returned to his old haunt, the Skin and Bones Club, to engage in his sadistic perversions, but his attempt to torture an innocent vagrant was interrupted by the intervention of Jack Russell, the Werewolf by Night. Ghost Rider also got involved in that conflict, but Mr. Hyde escaped yet again. After that, there was an incident in which a masked adventurer known as Jack Flag, real name Jack Harrison, attempted to join King Cobra's Serpent Society, secretly planning to oppose them from within. Not trusting Flag and wanting to get rid of him, Cobra sent the would-be initiate on a supposed test mission, tasking him with stealing a valuable painting from one of Calvin Zabo's safe houses. Hedging his bets, King Cobra then contacted Zabo himself, warning his former ally about the intruder in the hopes that Hyde would take care of Jack. Ironically, however, in the ensuing fight, Jack Flag was exposed to chemicals that endowed him with superhuman strength as well. In any event, Hyde ultimately let Flag escape and followed him back to the Serpent Society's headquarters, where he confronted King Cobra. However, the Cobra actually succeeded in diffusing the situation, offering Hyde drinks and conversation rather than a fight. The two even joined forces once again to battle Captain America, more or less burying the hatchet, and they have partnered on occasion after this. Since then, Mr. Hyde has continued to menace the various heroes of the Marvel Universe, but suffice it to say we don't have time to touch on all of his exploits here. He continued to use his dual identity to his advantage, at one point designing a watch that could inject him with a dose of his transformation serum at the press of a button. However, the authorities did ultimately learn that Calvin Zabo and Mr. Hyde were one and the same. At one point, he was recruited into a government-run version of the Thunderbolts. However, he shows no signs of actually reforming anytime soon, and is more often seen associating with villainous groups like the Hood's Supervillain Army, Baron Zemo's Army of Evil, and the Mad Thinker's Masters of Evil. He even sided with Hydra during their infamous takeover of the United States, which put him at odds with his estranged daughter, Daisy Johnson, but maybe we'll talk more about her another day. In the meantime, that's actually all I've got for you this week, but thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. And that being said, if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!